The lieutenant stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the road. His men were behind him, crouched low, waiting for the order that hadn't come yet. They'd been in position since dawn. The ambush was ready. The field of fire was perfect. They had done this before, but something was different this time. 20 minutes earlier, they had destroyed 3 enemy trucks, clean hits. The convoy had scattered just as expected. The survivors had pulled back into the forest on the opposite side of the road. And then, 15 minutes later, new trucks arrived. Not reinforcements, replacements. Same convoy, same route, different vehicles. The lieutenant looked down at his ammunition count, then at his men, then back at the road. They had expected resistance, they had expected counterattacks, they had even expected losses, but they had not expected this. To understand that moment, you have to understand what the German soldier believed going into this war. And it wasn't blind faith, it was earned confidence. By 1941, the Wehrmacht had conquered Poland in weeks. France, considered the strongest land army in Europe, had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk. Yugoslavia, Greece, and the Balkans had collapsed in rapid succession. German soldiers had fought against trained, determined armies and won decisively, not because of luck, because of preparation. They had better radios, better coordination between infantry, armor, and air support, officers who made decisions quickly without waiting for approval from distant headquarters, soldiers who had trained together for years, not months. This wasn't propaganda, it was observable reality. A German NCO in 1941 had likely fought in 2 or 3 campaigns already. He knew how to read terrain, how to respond under fire, how to move a squad through enemy contact without breaking apart. The average Allied soldier he faced was often recently mobilized, still learning, still adjusting. So when German soldiers moved east into the Soviet Union or held the line in North Africa or fought in Italy, they believed they were the better force, and for a long time, tactically, they were right. This was not arrogance, it was logic based on everything they had seen before. But logic only works when the rules stay the same. It started small. A squad would knock out an enemy tank only to see 2 more arrive the next day. Not older models, new ones. An infantry company would push the enemy out of a village, inflict heavy casualties, and then watch as a fresh unit, fully supplied, retook the position within 48 hours. This happened once, twice, then constantly. A Panzer commander in North Africa reported destroying more enemy tanks in a single engagement than intelligence had said existed in the entire sector. His after-action report was questioned, not because he was lying, but because the numbers didn't make sense. In the east, German forces encircled massive Soviet armies, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners, catastrophic losses by any measure, and yet, within weeks, new Soviet divisions appeared on the front line. At first, soldiers assumed these were poorly trained reserves, scraped together from second-line units, temporary reinforcements that would break under pressure. But they didn't. They fought, they took losses, and then more arrived. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We destroy them, and they return. We destroy them again, and they return again. Where are they coming from?" There was no panic yet, just confusion. The battles were still being won. The enemy was still retreating, but something fundamental had shifted, and no one could name it yet. By late 1942, early 1943, the pattern was undeniable. In the east, after the disaster at Stalingrad, German commanders began receiving reports that sounded impossible. Soviet artillery barrages were increasing in intensity, not because Soviet gunners had improved, but because there were simply more guns, thousands more. The Red Army, which had been pushed back 1,000 miles, was now fielding more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery than it had at the start of the war. In North Africa, British forces that had been beaten back repeatedly were suddenly counterattacking with new American-built tanks, Shermans, Grants, vehicles that hadn't existed in the theater 6 months earlier. And in the West, where the Allies hadn't even landed yet, reconnaissance units reported constant air activity, bombers, fighters, supply drops. The skies were filling up. German soldiers started noticing something else. When they captured enemy supply depots, they found mountains of equipment, ammunition crates stacked higher than a man could reach, fuel drums in rows that stretched hundreds of meters, rations, medical supplies, spare parts, all in quantities that seemed excessive. One German sergeant later recalled inspecting an American supply dump in Italy. "We thought they had been preparing for months. Then we learned it had been set up in 4 days." This wasn't better tactics. It wasn't superior morale. It was something else. The enemy wasn't running out, ever. And that realization was starting to spread through the ranks. What mattered wasn't how many tanks they destroyed. It was how many could be replaced. The moment didn't happen all at once. It wasn't a single battle or a single defeat. It was cumulative. A lieutenant realizes his company has been fighting with the same 200 men for 6 months, while the enemy rotates fresh units every few weeks. A tank commander watches his crew spend 3 days repairing a damaged transmission, while knocked-out enemy tanks are simply replaced overnight. An infantryman sees American soldiers discard equipment that his own unit would have considered irreplaceable. The realization wasn't that the enemy was stronger, it was that strength didn't matter anymore. German soldiers were still winning individual engagements. A veteran Panzer crew could take out 3 or 4 enemy tanks before being disabled. A well-positioned machine gun team could stop an entire infantry platoon. But then what? The 3 enemy tanks were replaced, the platoon was reinforced, and the German crew had no spare parts. The machine gun team had no resupply. One German officer described it like this: "We were playing chess against someone who had an endless supply of pieces. We could trade queens for pawns all day. It didn't matter. They would still have pieces left. We would not." This was the moment promised in the title. Not the moment they knew they would lose the next battle, the moment they realized they couldn't win the war. Because this wasn't a war of skill anymore. It was a war of sustainability. And in that kind of war, all the training, all the experience, all the tactical brilliance in the world couldn't overcome one simple fact: the other side would never run out. This was the point where experience stopped being an advantage. Let's pause and understand why this happened, because this isn't about courage or tactics or even technology. It's about something far more fundamental: industrial capacity. Germany's economy in 1939 was not built for a long war. It was designed to support rapid, decisive campaigns. Blitzkrieg wasn't just a strategy, it was a necessity. Germany lacked raw materials for sustained production. It imported oil, rubber, and rare metals. Its factories were efficient but limited in scale. By contrast, the Soviet Union had vast industrial capacity east of the Urals, far beyond the reach of German bombers. Entire factory complexes were relocated during the war, continuing production even as the front lines collapsed. The United States was in a different category entirely. In 1943 alone, the United States produced more than 85,000 aircraft. Germany produced around 25,000. The U.S. built nearly 30,000 tanks that same year. Germany built fewer than 12,000. But it wasn't just the numbers, it was the system. American supply lines stretched across oceans, supported by the largest merchant fleet ever assembled. Factories operated around the clock. Standardized parts meant repairs could happen in hours, not days. German logistics, by contrast, were breaking down. Horses still pulled most supply wagons on the Eastern Front. Trains were targeted by partisan groups and air raids. Every mile gained made supply harder. And there was another factor: replacements. When an American or Soviet unit took casualties, replacements arrived in weeks. Fresh soldiers, fully equipped, recently trained. When a German unit took casualties, the survivors stayed in the line. Companies that started with 200 men were operating with 80. This created a compounding problem. Experienced soldiers became cautious, spread thin.
New recruits, when they arrived, were undertrained and thrown into combat too quickly. Units that had once operated with precision became brittle. Meanwhile, the Allies were learning. Early in the war, German forces had faced inexperienced opponents. By 1943, those armies were competent, coordinated, and supported by systems Germany couldn't match. Germany was fighting for victories. The Allies were fighting for sustainability. And in a war of sustainability, the side that can replace losses, maintain supply, and outlast attrition will win. Not quickly, not cleanly, but inevitably.
Once belief collapses, behavior changes. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly, in ways that shift everything. Soldiers stopped talking about winning the war. They started talking about surviving the next week. Officers stopped planning offensives. They started planning retreats, figuring out how to pull back without losing cohesion. Veterans stopped teaching new recruits long-term tactics. They taught them how to dig in, how to move under fire, how to recognize when a position was lost and it was time to fall back. There was still discipline. Units still followed orders. Soldiers still fought, often ferociously. But the reason changed. They weren't fighting to win anymore. They were fighting because the alternative was worse. Fighting to protect the men beside them. Fighting to buy time for a retreat. Fighting because stopping meant capture or death. Morale didn't shatter. It corroded. One German soldier, captured in late 1944, was asked by an interrogator why his unit had fought so hard if they knew the war was lost. His answer was simple. We fought because we were still soldiers, but we stopped believing in victory a long time ago. This shift is visible in the records. Desertion rates increased, not massively, but noticeably. More soldiers surrendered when given the chance, especially in the West where treatment as a POW was more predictable. But more telling were the quiet acts of self-preservation. Units began hoarding supplies, even when ordered to redistribute them. Officers delayed attacks, citing shortages or bad intelligence. Soldiers stopped volunteering for dangerous assignments. None of this was mutiny. It was exhaustion mixed with realism. And it created a feedback loop. As experienced soldiers became more cautious, newer recruits had fewer role models showing confidence. As officers lost faith in high command, orders were questioned more often. As supply failures became routine, initiative gave way to passivity. The German military didn't collapse in a single moment. It eroded day by day as the gap between what soldiers were asked to do and what they believed was possible grew wider. By 1945, there were still German units fighting with skill and determination, but they were islands in a force that had fundamentally changed. The war was still being fought, but in the minds of the men doing the fighting, it was already over. This raises a question that haunted many after the war. If soldiers knew the outcome was inevitable, why did the fighting continue for so long? The answer isn't simple. For individual soldiers, the choice wasn't between fighting and ending the war. It was between fighting and facing immediate consequences. Stopping meant defying orders. In the German military, that often meant court-martial, execution in some cases. Not just for the soldier, but sometimes their family faced consequences. Stopping might have meant abandoning positions, leaving other units exposed. It might have meant handing over territory where civilians would face retribution. So many kept fighting, not because they believed in victory, but because they couldn't see a moral path to surrender. At higher levels, the calculus was different but equally trapped. Officers who understood the war was lost had no power to end it. Officers who had the power refused to accept reality. By 1944, Hitler's grip on military command was absolute. Officers who questioned strategy were removed, imprisoned, or worse.
After the failed assassination attempt in July 1944, even suggesting alternative strategies became dangerous. Some commanders hoped for a political solution, a split between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union, some negotiated settlement that would allow Germany to survive even in defeat. But the Allies had declared unconditional surrender. There would be no negotiation. So the machinery of war continued, not because anyone believed it would change the outcome, but because no one with the power to stop it was willing to face what stopping meant. This is one of the darkest aspects of war, the way it traps people in situations where every choice is terrible, and the least terrible choice is to continue.
This story isn't really about Germany. It's about the nature of belief in war and how wars end long before the fighting stops. We tend to think of wars as decided by battles, turning points, moments when one side gains an advantage that becomes insurmountable. And sometimes that's true. But more often, wars are decided by something quieter, the realization spreading through an army that the outcome is inevitable. Not because of a single defeat, because of the pattern, the accumulation, the slow recognition that no amount of skill or courage can overcome the fundamental imbalance. For German soldiers, that realization came at different times. Some saw it in 1942. Others held on until 1944. A few never accepted it at all. But for most, there was a moment when the math became undeniable. They could win this battle, maybe the next one, but they couldn't win them all. And the enemy only needed to keep coming back. That's the lesson history rarely teaches clearly. Wars aren't won by the side that fights hardest, or even the side that fights best. They're won by the side that can sustain the fight longer than the opponent can maintain belief. And once that belief collapses, everything that follows is just the war catching up to what soldiers already know. The German soldier at the edge of the tree line understood this before his commanders admitted it, before historians documented it, before the maps showed it. He understood it the moment he saw those replacement trucks arrive 15 minutes after destroying the first 3. In that moment, the war changed. Not on paper, not in headquarters, but in the place where wars are actually fought, in the minds of the men holding the line. The lieutenant stood at the edge of the tree line, watching the road. His men were still behind him, waiting for orders that would come eventually, because orders always came. They would engage. They would destroy some of those trucks. They might even stop this convoy. And then tomorrow, or the day after, or the week after, more trucks would arrive. The lieutenant had been a good officer. He still was. He would make the tactical decisions that kept his men alive. He would follow his orders. He would do everything a soldier was supposed to do. But something had changed. Not in his training, not in his discipline, not in his courage, in his belief. He no longer believed they were fighting to win. He believed they were fighting because the alternative was worse, and that's a different kind of war entirely. The war didn't end when Berlin fell. It ended in moments like this, scattered across 1,000 roads, 1,000 tree lines, 1,000 positions where a soldier looked at what was in front of them and realized the pattern would never change. Wars end twice, once in reality and once in the minds of the people fighting them. For Germany, those endings were years apart, and every day between them was the war catching up to what the soldiers already knew.